For years, Venezuela looked like a country the world had moved past, rich in oil but sidelined by crisis and sanctions. Then in early January 2026, U.S. forces captured President Nicolas Maduro and flew him to the United States to face drug and corruption charges. Overnight, a forgotten energy giant was pulled back into the center of global attention. The shock was not just about a leader falling, but about what his removal unlocked. Venezuela sits on some of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, a fact markets never truly forget. When production collapsed under Maduro's government in Caracas, energy flows shifted and rivals filled the gap. Now the U.S. government, through the Pentagon and the State Department, is openly tying power, oil, and influence back together in the Western Hemisphere. Welcome to Global Insight. The central question is not why Nicolas Maduro fell, but why the United States chose this moment to act. Under President Donald Trump's second administration, Washington is signaling that Latin America is no longer a secondary theater. Venezuela's oil did not suddenly become valuable again, it always was. What changed is how openly power is now being used to control it. This creates a paradox where legal charges, military force, and energy markets move together. By the end of this video, you will understand how Venezuela's oil shaped decades of global energy politics. You will see why the U.S. government framed Maduro's capture as both law enforcement and strategic necessity. You will understand how this decision alters calculations in Beijing under Xi Jinping and in Moscow under Vladimir Putin. Most importantly, you will see how energy control still defines influence in the modern world, and why this moment marks a shift many governments quietly anticipated but hoped to avoid. Venezuela's modern role begins with oil discoveries in the early 20th century. In 1922, the Barroso No. 2 well erupted near Lake Maracaibo. Foreign firms like Royal Dutch Shell and Standard Oil moved in quickly. The country became a top global exporter within a generation. Oil tied Venezuela's fate to external markets from the start. After World War II, U.S. demand anchored this relationship. Washington treated Venezuelan crude as a secure hemispheric supply. Presidents from Harry Truman onward encouraged investment and stability. Caracas used oil revenue to fund growth and social programs. The bargain worked while prices stayed high and politics stayed aligned. The turning point came in 1976 under President Carlos Andrés Pérez. Venezuela nationalized its oil industry and created PDVSA. Control shifted to the state, but expertise remained largely intact. For years, PDVSA was considered a competent national oil company. High output gave Venezuela influence inside OPEC during the 1980s. That balance changed in 1999 with the election of Hugo Chavez. Chavez redirected PDVSA toward political goals and social spending. Experienced managers were sidelined after the 2002 strike. Production capacity eroded as maintenance and investment declined. Oil became a tool of ideology rather than long-term strategy. After Chavez's death in 2013, Nicolas Maduro inherited a fragile system. Falling oil prices exposed years of mismanagement. Inflation surged and output collapsed under Maduro's government. By 2019, U.S. sanctions under President Donald Trump tightened the squeeze. Venezuela's exports fell to a fraction of their former levels. As Venezuelan barrels disappeared, others stepped in. Saudi Arabia increased output under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Russia, led by Vladimir Putin, deepened energy ties with Caracas. China under Xi Jinping accepted oil shipments to repay state loans. Venezuela shifted from market supplier to geopolitical client. These shifts mattered because oil trade shapes financial power. For decades, most Venezuelan crude was sold in U.S. dollars. Reduced flows weakened Caracas and complicated dollar-based trade. Alternative arrangements tested payment systems outside U.S. oversight. Energy disruptions quietly fed larger monetary debates. By the mid-2000s, Venezuela's oil was still underground but politically frozen. The reserves remained among the world's largest on paper. What changed was the cost of keeping them idle. Energy insecurity after 2022 made dormant supply more strategic. History set the conditions long before the current rupture. The mechanism begins with legal authority rather than tanks on the ground. U.S. prosecutors in the Southern District of New York had sealed indictments against Nicolas Maduro for years. These cases were built by the Department of Justice under Attorneys General William Barr and later Pam Bondi. They alleged narcotics trafficking linked to the Cartel de los Soles. The legal groundwork existed long before the operation itself. What changed was the decision to enforce it physically. That decision came from the White House under Donald Trump's second administration. The National Security Council coordinated with the Pentagon and the State Department. Defense Secretary Christopher Miller approved the operational framework. The justification combined law enforcement with national security. Venezuela was framed as a criminal state threatening regional stability. This reframing allowed military execution without declaring war. The operation itself was narrow and targeted. U.S. Special Operations Command handled the capture phase. There was no occupation of Caracas or seizure of government buildings. Maduro was detained and transferred under U.S. custody protocols. The message was precision, not regime-wide chaos. Force was used like a scalpel, not a hammer. Once Maduro was removed, control shifted to institutions, not individuals. The U.S. Treasury, through the Office of Foreign Assets Control, adjusted sanctions. Licenses were issued to allow limited oil transactions. Chevron, ExxonMobil, and ConocoPhillips entered negotiations. PDVSA assets abroad were placed under supervised management. Oil flows became conditional rather than blocked. Pricing was the next lever. Under Maduro, Venezuelan crude sold at deep discounts. U.S. managed sales raised prices closer to global benchmarks. This increased revenue without immediately restoring full sovereignty. Buyers in India and Europe accepted the new terms. Energy markets responded to reliability more than ideology. Investment followed pricing clarity. The U.S. Commerce Department opened talks with private firms. Capital expenditure focused on refineries and pipelines. Production targets were set gradually, not aggressively. The goal was stability, not a sudden flood of supply. Measured output prevented price shocks elsewhere. Diplomacy worked in parallel with finance. Secretary of State Marco Rubio engaged regional governments. Brazil under President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was briefed early. Colombia's leadership was consulted on border security. The Organization of American States issued cautious statements. Legitimacy was constructed step by step. International law provided cover but not consensus. The United Nations Security Council did not authorize the action. Russia and China objected but avoided escalation. Both relied on Venezuelan oil yet lacked enforcement leverage. The absence of retaliation signaled acceptance of new limits. Power operated where vetoes could not reach. Currency mechanics quietly reinforced the shift. Oil sales reverted to dollar-based clearing systems. U.S. banks processed payments under Treasury oversight. Alternative settlement channels were sidelined. This restored financial visibility Washington had lost. Energy and currency moved back into alignment. At its core, the mechanism linked force, law, and markets. Remove the leader, unlock the asset, manage the flow. Each step relied on named institutions with defined roles. Nothing depended on secrecy once it began. The structure worked because every actor knew the sequence. Predictability, not surprise, sustained control. The primary leverage sits in Washington, not Caracas. The White House under Donald Trump's second administration sets the political frame. The U.S. Treasury controls sanctions, licenses, and payment channels. The Department of Justice holds custody and legal timing. Together, these institutions decide how fast access is restored. Energy companies form the second pressure center: Chevron, ExxonMobil, and ConocoPhillips. Control expertise Venezuela lacks. Their investment decisions determine production recovery speed. They answer to U.S. regulators and shareholders, not local politics. Capital discipline becomes a tool of influence. Regional governments hold a quieter form of leverage. Brazil under Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva influences legitimacy in South America. Colombia's cooperation affects borders and logistics. Mexico's stance shapes diplomatic cover in hemispheric forums. Support or resistance alters the political cost of control. Russia's leverage has narrowed sharply. Vladimir Putin's government once backed Maduro through Rosneft. Those assets now face legal and operational constraints. Moscow lacks enforcement power in the Caribbean basin. Its influence is reduced to statements, not outcomes. China's position under Xi Jinping is more complex. Beijing still holds outstanding oil-backed loans, but repayment depends on flows approved by Washington. China avoids confrontation to protect trade elsewhere. Economic exposure limits strategic response. Markets themselves apply the final pressure. OPEC members watch supply levels closely. Saudi Arabia adjusts output to prevent instability. Traders price Venezuelan oil on reliability, not ideology. Leverage concentrates where predictability is enforced. History shows what happens when energy control fractures suddenly. In 1979, Iran's oil output collapsed after the fall of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Carter administration faced price spikes and fuel shortages. Global inflation surged as supply chains tightened. Political shock translated directly into economic pain. A similar pattern appeared in Iraq in 2003. After Saddam Hussein's government fell under George W. Bush's administration, oil infrastructure damage slowed recovery for years. Markets misjudged how quickly production could return. Instability proved more costly than embargoes. Libya offers another cautionary case. When Muammar Gaddafi was removed in 2011, NATO intervention fractured state control over oil fields. Competing militias disrupted exports repeatedly. Energy wealth became a source of fragmentation, not recovery. Venezuela carries its own historical warning. In 2002, the PDVSA strike cut production sharply. President Hugo Chavez purged technical leadership afterward. Output never fully recovered from that moment. Institutional damage outlasted the political crisis. Currency systems also absorbed the impact. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 under Vladimir Putin, energy sanctions accelerated de-dollarization experiments. Payment fragmentation increased transaction costs worldwide. Markets adjusted, but efficiency declined. If leverage over Venezuelan oil weakens abruptly, competing claims could reemerge over assets and contracts. Regional governments would face renewed uncertainty. Energy prices would respond before diplomacy settles. History shows repair always costs more than control. This matters now because energy prices still shape daily life. Gasoline, electricity, and transport costs respond to supply certainty. When Venezuelan oil re-enters markets under U.S. oversight, price volatility narrows even if prices do not fall sharply. Stability becomes the signal households feel first. Energy politics quietly set the cost of living. Jobs are tied to these decisions more than most people realize. U.S. energy firms expand hiring when investment risk drops. Refining, shipping, and services respond to predictable output. Latin American economies linked to supply chains adjust employment plans. Uncertainty freezes hiring faster than recessions do. Energy confidence supports labor confidence. Government budgets move with energy flows. Export revenues shape public spending in producer states. Import costs affect subsidies and infrastructure elsewhere. Finance ministries plan around fuel assumptions. Sudden disruption forces cuts before voters understand why. Stability buys political breathing room. At a broader level, this touches global order. Energy trade supports currency demand and payment systems. Reliable supply reinforces established financial channels. Disruption invites experimentation and fragmentation. The Venezuelan shift signals which path is being enforced. Order is maintained not by rhetoric, but by flow. Venezuela's sudden return is not about one country alone. It reflects how power still moves through energy, law, and enforcement. The actors are named, the sequence is visible, and the pattern is familiar. What feels new is how openly it is being reasserted. If you're looking for clear, in-depth analysis of economics and geopolitics that goes beyond surface-level news, subscribe to Global Insight. Beyond the headlines.